The winter light over the North Atlantic had a color that seemed neither born of the sun nor belonging to the sea, a pale, exhausted shimmer stretched thin across waters that had swallowed whole fleets and whispered the names of men long gone. In that uneasy half-glow, 3 British divers sat hunched inside the belly of a converted trawler that groaned with every rise of the waves, each man silently rehearsing the mission that would soon mark them as ghosts, even before they vanished into the freezing depths. The Admiralty had chosen them not because they were fearless, but because each one, in his own quiet way, had already carried loss deep enough to make the prospect of death feel like a familiar, almost manageable shadow. Their target, a Nazi supply ship anchored discreetly within a fjord carved by ancient glaciers, was vital to the enemy's northern operations, feeding submarines that prowled the convoy routes like steel predators. The ship was rumored to be reinforced with experimental armor and guarded by patrols that trusted the brutal weather more than their own vigilance, believing no human would willingly enter those waters. Yet these divers, hardened by training that stripped them to the marrow, were expected to glide beneath the hull like phantoms and plant charges designed not just to sink a vessel, but to cripple a chain of war that stretched across thousands of miles. Inside the vessel that carried them toward the Norwegian coast, the air was thick with diesel, damp wool, and an unspoken heaviness that settled over the crew like accumulated frost. The divers checked their gear with slow, deliberate movements, fingers trembling not from fear, but from cold that seemed to preemptively claim their bones. Outside, wind scraped across the deck in jagged bursts, and the captain paced in near silence, glancing at the horizon where black mountains rose from the sea like the ribs of a sleeping giant. This was a mission built on timing, calculation, and hope worn so thin it could snap at the slightest misstep. The men knew the probability of return was minimal. Their suits were barely resistant to the frigid temperatures, and the fjord's currents were notoriously unpredictable. Still, there was something sacred about undertaking a task no one else dared attempt, a grim honor that filled them with a determination as steady as the heartbeat. They tried not to think too much about. They had studied every contour of the enemy ship, its underwater ridges, its blind spots, and the peculiar rhythm of its anchor chains, preparing themselves to move in darkness so complete that even the outline of their own hands might dissolve into the void. As night settled fully, the trawler cut its engine and drifted into silence, swallowed by cliffs that seemed to press inward, narrowing the world to a cold corridor where echoes died quickly. The divers assembled near the small launch platform, their breath forming pale ghosts in the black air, and for a moment, the only sound was the slow, rhythmic sloshing of the sea against the hull. Above them, weak northern lights unfurled like torn ribbons suspended in the sky, illuminating the water just enough to reveal its surface trembling with secrets. The mission commander, a man who had lost 2 brothers at Dunkirk and carried their memory like a hidden wound, nodded once, a gesture carrying all the weight of prayer and farewell. There were no words to fill the space that followed. Words would have only emphasized the unbearable truth, that each man stepping into the water was leaving behind not just the safety of the vessel, but the fragile thread tying him to the world he hoped to return to. The descent into the fjord was immediate and brutal. The water tightened around their bodies with a cold so sharp it felt metallic, as though the sea itself had been forged rather than born. Their lights remained off, for stealth was more vital than orientation, and they relied on instinct honed through months of drills conducted in everything from flooded quarries to pitch-black coastal inlets. Beneath them, the ocean floor dropped away into a void that made the divers feel simultaneously weightless and crushed. And above them, the distorted silhouette of the Nazi ship grew slowly into focus, its vast underbelly looming like the carcass of some prehistoric beast suspended in darkness. The sound of distant boots and muffled machinery filtered through the water, faint and ghost-like, reminders that while the divers moved unseen, they were surrounded by the heart of the enemy's war engine. With meticulous precision, they unlatched the explosives from their belts and placed them along the hull's vulnerable points, fingers numb but movements unwavering, synchronizing their internal clocks to the final sequence that would determine whether the mission succeeded or dissolved into tragedy. By the time they completed the last placement, the current had shifted with a violence that startled even these seasoned men, dragging them slightly off course, stirring silt that shimmered in their peripheral vision like disturbed memories. They attempted to correct their path toward the extraction point, but the sea seemed to close behind them, reshaping itself into an opaque labyrinth. The cold gnawed deeper, weakening muscles that had been drilled to resist pain, and their breaths grew shallow as the depth pressed insistently against their chests. In the distance, they heard the muted creak of the enemy ship, unaware of the small constellation of destruction now anchored to its hull. The divers pushed forward, swimming into a darkness that felt increasingly like a final embrace. Yet they continued, driven not by the hope of survival, but by the quiet, resolute understanding that sacrifice was sometimes the only language war allowed the brave to speak. And somewhere above, beyond the reach of the black water, the trawler waited in silence, its crew listening for the signal that would never come in time. When the first explosion rolled through the fjord, it did not sound like thunder, but like the earth itself exhaling after years of holding its breath. The Nazi ship, once an immovable fortress of steel, convulsed in the water, its hull torn open by the disciplined precision of men who no longer floated among the living. Flames erupted where moments before there had been only reflection and darkness, painting the frozen cliffs with furious light that flickered like a dying god's heartbeat. On the trawler anchored in the shadows, the British crew watched in awe and silence, the success of the mission crashing over them in a wave of disbelief and grief, entwined so tightly that one could not be separated from the other. The captain gripped the railing, his knuckles white against the rust, his face illuminated by fire blooming on the water's surface. They had done it. The divers had struck a wound into the enemy's artery so deep it would bleed across the northern theatre for months. Yet as the crew scanned the icy surface for movement, for even the faintest shimmer of light that might announce their comrades' return, the sea offered only the cruel shimmer of reflection. The fjord swallowed its heroes as effortlessly as it had accepted the enemy's ruin. For hours they waited. The captain ordered flares to remain unlit, for fear of drawing patrol boats now frantically sweeping the coastline, their searchlights cutting erratic paths through the smoke and mist. The air carried the metallic scent of burned oil and seawater, and every distant boom of collapsing metal echoed like a requiem. The radio crackled with intercepted German chatter, panic, confusion, disbelief that such sabotage could be carried out so close to their guarded perimeter. A lesser commander might have celebrated. This one could not. He knew that for every explosion that shook the enemy's confidence, there was always a quiet aftermath where the cost settled in like a ghost sitting at the table. He imagined the divers beneath the waves, drifting among the fragments of their victory, faces pale and serene in the unending dark, their lungs filling with the same cold silence that now haunted the trawler's deck. To send men into the sea was to make a pact with absence, and now that absence pressed heavily on every man aboard. As dawn crawled over the peaks, the fjord looked almost tranquil again. The smoke had thinned into delicate ribbons that caught the first light, and the water was eerily calm, hiding the violence it had witnessed only hours before. A faint layer of ash floated on the surface, mingling with the ice, and the ship's charred skeleton jutted from the water like the spine of a drowned beast. The crew retrieved what they could: a fragment of a suit, a broken compass, a glove stiff with salt, and each item was treated not as debris, but as relic, fragments of courage that defied the sea's attempt to erase all traces. They charted a return course through narrow channels, avoiding detection, every man on board moving with the subdued reverence of those who had seen both triumph and loss braided into a single act. They would reach base and report the mission's success, but in their silence there would be no triumphal tone, only the heavy dignity of those who knew that heroism rarely leaves witnesses. Back in Britain, weeks later, when the report reached the Admiralty, it was read in a dimly lit room thick with cigarette smoke and exhaustion. The officers understood immediately what had been accomplished and what it had cost. The operation had not only crippled a supply line, but sent a psychological tremor through German command. proving that even their most fortified harbors were vulnerable. Yet the names of the 3 divers were recorded without ceremony, their mission classified, their sacrifice folded quietly into the ledger of wartime secrecy. Medals would be struck in absentia, commendations written, but no one outside those walls would ever know the story behind the sinking. It was as if the sea had swallowed their existence entirely, leaving behind only ripples of rumor. Somewhere along the northern coast, fishermen spoke of strange shapes glimpsed under the water on quiet nights, of faint metallic glimmers that might have been the remnants of equipment or perhaps something less tangible. A lingering echo of men who had not yet fully let go of their purpose. In the quiet towns where those divers had once lived, where wives waited beside radios and mothers left porch lights burning long after blackout hours ended, the war continued its relentless rhythm. Letters were never answered. Official notices arrived in careful envelopes, their wording precise, the ink respectful, but the emptiness they carried was immeasurable. The sea had no grave markers, and that absence gnawed at the families more than any headline of victory could soothe. The youngest diver's mother was said to have walked to the harbour each morning for months, staring at the horizon as if willing the tide to return what it had taken. The commander's wife, who had known the risk he bore, chose to believe that somewhere beneath the northern lights he still floated, preserved by the cold, unaging, waiting for the world to remember. In time, the story faded from military logs and public memory alike, yet among those who served in the secretive diving units that followed, the tale endured, whispered across mess halls and training camps as a legend of the sea. They spoke of it, not with sadness but with awe, a reminder that the ocean demands its own kind of valor, one that accepts disappearance as part of the duty. The British divers who sabotaged the Nazi ship had not simply vanished. They had become part of the deep, their sacrifice suspended eternally in the dark water that had both hidden and honored them. And as their story drifts through time, perhaps it reaches you now, across the distance of decades and waves, asking for nothing but remembrance. If you've made it this far into their story, take a moment to honor their courage. Subscribe to the journey so their voices, though lost to the sea, are never forgotten. Years passed, and the war that had devoured continents slowly drew to its end, leaving behind a Europe reshaped by ruins and silence. Cities rose again from ash, flags returned to masts, and nations pretended that the world could simply resume breathing where it had left off. Yet in certain corners of memory, the sea remained restless. Along the northern coastlines, fishermen still told stories of a ship that had burned like a second sun in the fjord, of a night when the aurora seemed to mourn rather than dance, and of the divers who never came back. Their tale had become part of local myth, a merging of truth and reverence that gave the sea its own kind of holiness. No official plaque bore their names, no ceremony marked the place where they had vanished. But sometimes, when storms passed and the water turned calm as glass, people claimed they could hear faint metallic clicks beneath the waves, like the ticking of watches still counting down in the dark. One of those who never stopped listening was Lieutenant Arthur Miles, a naval engineer who had trained with the divers before the mission. He had been too ill to join them that winter, bedridden with pneumonia that left him weak and ashamed as his comrades embarked on what would become their final descent. When news of their success and disappearance reached him, he felt both pride and an unbearable debt. After the war, he returned to civilian life, working on docks and shipyards. But his nights were haunted by recurring dreams. The image of the fjord, of 3 figures sinking slowly into a blue so deep it was indistinguishable from eternity. In those dreams, he sometimes saw flashes of light, as though their torches still flickered in the depths, guiding him towards something unfinished. Eventually, unable to bear the uncertainty, he began compiling reports, maps, sonar readings, anything that could help him locate the wreck. His obsession grew quietly, almost shamefully, until it became the quiet pulse of his existence. By the late 1950s, the war had become history. The new Europe was one of reconstruction, industry, and nuclear anxiety. Old stories were being replaced by new fears. But Arthur could not let go. He secured permission through old contacts in the Admiralty to conduct a private survey in Norwegian waters, citing historical research. The truth, which he shared with no one, was simpler. He wanted to find the place where the divers had died, not to retrieve them, for he knew the sea does not return what it claims, but to acknowledge them, to prove that they had not dissolved entirely into myth. When his small vessel reached the fjord, he was struck by how unchanged it seemed. The cliffs still rose like cathedral walls. The air still carried that glacial stillness that made time feel suspended. Yet there was a strange peace to it too, as though the sea, having once taken, now waited quietly to be remembered. His sonar detected what appeared to be a massive structure lodged in the silt at nearly 100 meters depth, most likely the remains of the Nazi ship. With his limited equipment, Arthur descended only once, using a crude diving suit far inferior to those of wartime design. He never reached the wreck itself, but at 70 meters he saw something that stilled him. A faint shimmer of light reflecting off a metallic surface partially buried in the seabed. It might have been part of a hull, or perhaps one of the diver's old oxygen tanks, but what struck him was not its form, but its stillness. It seemed untouched by time, preserved in the cold darkness like an offering. He returned to the surface trembling, unsure whether what he had seen was real or a trick of exhaustion, but from that moment he no longer needed proof. The sea had answered him in its own language, one that spoke of permanence through absence. In the years that followed, Arthur wrote a manuscript about the divers, part memoir, part elegy, entitled The Silent Depth. It was never published, rejected by editors who found it too mournful, too obscure, too personal for public taste. He placed the pages in a wooden box and left it to gather dust in his attic, believing no one would ever read it. Decades later, long after his death, his granddaughter, a historian researching classified operations of World War II, found the manuscript and the accompanying maps. What she read moved her to tears. In the brittle paper, she felt not just the grief of a man who had survived when others had not, but the profound tenderness of a generation that had learned to live with ghosts. She travelled to Norway, following the notes her grandfather had left, and stood upon the edge of the fjord where the diver's story had ended. The air was still sharp, the water mirror-like. As the northern lights unfurled once more, she read aloud the final passage of his manuscript, a line written in trembling ink. Somewhere in the dark, they are still working. Somewhere beneath this silence, they still breathe. The sea remained calm that night, yet those who lived near the coast later swore they heard a distant rumble, faint, rhythmic, almost like the slow heartbeat of the deep. No one could explain it, and perhaps it was nothing more than shifting ice or the hum of distant currents. But for her, it was enough. She felt as though the divers, in some unknowable way, had heard her voice and answered back. She left a small plaque on a rock overlooking the fjord, engraved with no names, only a single line from her grandfather's writing. For those who went down and never rose, the sea remembers. And so, memory persisted, not through headlines or monuments, but through quiet acts of remembrance that ripple outward, like sound through deep water. The war had ended long ago, yet its echoes still drifted beneath the surface, carried by the tide. By the 1970s, the war had receded far enough into the past to become history taught in classrooms, rather than pain carried in the chest, and yet the sea that had taken those divers remained as inscrutable as ever. Technology had advanced, sonar had grown more precise, and the age of exploration beneath the surface had begun to reveal the ocean's hidden architecture. Oil companies mapped seabeds, governments monitored submarine routes, and archaeologists began searching for wrecks long lost to rumour. Among those drawn to this new frontier was a young Norwegian researcher named Erik Lund, whose fascination with the stories of his homeland's occupied years had begun with his grandfather's tales of the mysterious explosion in the fjord. For Erik, the war was not a grand narrative of nations, but a collection of small human silences, men who vanished, letters that never arrived, families who lived half their lives in waiting. When he learned of the legend surrounding the British divers, he became obsessed, sensing that within their disappearance lay something purer than victory, an act of devotion so complete it had transcended recognition. With a small grant and outdated equipment, Eric organized a private expedition to explore the fjord. His team consisted of 3 others, a marine biologist, a local diver, and a cameraman from Oslo who wanted to capture the undersea world that most people never imagined existed. The mission was scientific on paper, but in truth it was spiritual, a pilgrimage into the cold heart of history. When they reached the fjord, they were greeted by the same oppressive stillness described in every account. The cliffs that rose like walls of stone memory, the air heavy with salt and secrecy, the water dark enough to swallow daylight whole. Locals watched from the shore, murmuring blessings under their breath. They still believed the place was haunted, not by malevolent forces, but by souls who had simply never found their way home. Eric's descent began at dawn. The light above was thin, filtered through mist, and by the time he passed 30 meters, the world had turned to shadow. He moved slowly, each breath loud in his ears, the hiss of oxygen rhythmic, meditative. At 50 meters he saw the first traces, fragments of metal, perhaps from the Nazi ship's hull, crusted with coral and ice. He followed a ridge downward until his lamp's beam caught something unexpected. A faint line of shapes half buried in silt, aligned with almost deliberate symmetry. He approached carefully, brushing away sediment with gloved hands. Beneath the veil of time, he saw the unmistakable outline of a human form. The diving suit was nearly intact, its rubber hardened and discolored by decades underwater. The faceplate of the helmet had shattered inward, and inside, where the face should have been, there was only a hollow dark that seemed to look back at him. He stayed frozen, staring into that emptiness, the weight of years pressing down like the pressure of the water itself. Then he noticed something else. Near the diver's right hand, half buried in silt, was a small cylindrical object. He reached for it and realized it was a compass, its glass fogged, its needle trembling faintly, as though still remembering direction. He placed it carefully into a pouch and signaled to ascend, unable to breathe properly. As he rose through the layers of blue and black, he felt the strange sensation that someone was rising with him. Not as a presence, but as memory returning to the surface after too long submerged. That night, in the cabin of his research vessel, Eric sat by the window watching the lights of the fjord shimmer across the water. He felt both reverence and sorrow, a sense of having trespassed on something sacred. The compass lay on the table beside him, still trembling slightly, as though alive. He thought about the man who had once carried it, about the silence that had followed his death, about how war had turned thousands of such lives into footnotes. Yet in that simple object, there was continuity, a small circle of glass and metal bridging decades of forgetting. He knew he could not leave it in a museum, labelled and sterilized. It deserved something more human. The next morning, as the sun broke over the peaks, he returned the compass to the water, letting it sink slowly, glinting once before the depths claimed it again. The gesture felt less like surrender and more like communion, a recognition that some stories are meant to remain where they began. When he returned to Oslo, Eric wrote a paper detailing the expedition's findings. Officially, it spoke of unidentified human remains consistent with mid-20th century military diving equipment. But privately, he included a final paragraph omitted from publication, written in his journal. They are still down there, not as bodies, but as intention. They are the line between the living and the forgotten. The sea does not keep them. It becomes them. That sentence, though unseen by most, circulated quietly among researchers and divers who read it like scripture, a poetic truth that said more than any technical report ever could. In the following years, the fjord became a site of pilgrimage for divers, historians, and descendants of lost servicemen. They came not seeking closure but contact, descending into that silent cathedral of cold water to feel, if only for a moment, the proximity of the past. Wreaths of poppies were occasionally left to drift on the surface each November, their red petals spinning like fragile echoes of blood and honor. And though no government ever officially recognized the site, locals began referring to it simply as the resting place, a name spoken with both reverence and familiarity. The war had ended decades ago, but in that narrow stretch of Norwegian sea, time remained folded upon itself, every ripple a reminder of the night when 3 men descended into eternity for the sake of others who would never know their names. And so the story endured, not in history books, but in hearts and whispers, in the quiet understanding that some acts of courage are not meant for applause, but for remembrance. The British divers who sabotaged the Nazi ship had long ceased to exist as men of flesh, yet in the depths, where light rarely reaches, their story pulsed on, a heartbeat beneath the cold, eternal sea. By the time the 21st century dawned, the world had changed its gods. Satellites now mapped every corner of the earth, submarines reached depths once thought unreachable, and war had become a matter of drones and data rather than bodies and breath. Yet, in a quiet stretch of the Norwegian coast, the old fishermen still told the same story. They spoke of a night long ago when the sky burned green and red above a sea that caught fire, when 3 men slipped into the water to wound a monster and were never seen again. They told it with the solemn cadence of prayer, their eyes on the horizon as though half expecting the ocean itself to nod in acknowledgement. Tourists sometimes laughed at the tale, calling it folklore, but the locals only smiled faintly and said that some truths are too heavy for documents. They live instead in currents and salt. It was this story that first drew Isla Miles, a British filmmaker and the great-granddaughter of Lieutenant Arthur Miles, to the fjord. She had grown up hearing fragments of the family legend, the lost divers, the compass, her ancestors' manuscripts sealed in a wooden box. To her, it had always felt like something between a dream and a confession. When she became a documentarian, chronicling forgotten war histories, she knew one day she would return to that place her blood remembered, even if her mind did not. In 2022, she finally stood on the same shore her ancestors' granddaughter had visited decades before. The cold wind tasting of metal and rain, the water dark as a bruise beneath the northern lights. She carried with her a small waterproof urn containing a handful of ashes, not of any of the divers, for none had ever been recovered, but of her father, who had kept their memory alive in bedtime stories whispered with reverence. Her goal was simple: to tell the divers' story through film, to let the world see them not as statistics or nameless heroes, but as men who had laughed, feared, and loved before the sea took them. She interviewed local historians, naval archivists, and the aging diver who had once worked with Erik Lund. Each interview revealed fragments, contradictions, and small miracles of coincidence. The compass that had been found and returned to the depths, the sonar images still stored in university archives, the whispers of metallic tapping heard by oil rig crews working miles offshore. Piece by piece, Isla reconstructed the narrative not as a chronicle of war, but as a hymn to remembrance. The sea, she realized, was not the antagonist of this story. It was the keeper, the witness, the silent guardian of what humankind had forgotten. When the time came to film underwater, her team used state-of-the-art submersibles equipped with high-resolution cameras and robotic arms. The descent was broadcast live on monitors aboard their vessel, and as the cameras slipped into the black, Isla felt the same weight that her great-grandfather must have felt, that mixture of awe and guilt, reverence and intrusion. At 80 meters, shapes began to emerge. The corroded ribs of the Nazi ship, draped in kelp like funereal cloth, debris scattered across the seabed, the faint outline of what could only be a human form, seated upright against the wreck, a tangle of cables across its chest like rosary beads of rust. The silence in the control room was total. The cameraman zoomed in slowly, revealing a piece of torn fabric still clinging to the suit, faintly bearing the letters RN, Royal Navy. Isla pressed her hand against the screen, not to touch what she saw, but to promise she would carry it forward. For the first time, the divers were no longer ghosts of rumor. They were visible, tangible, indisputably real. Back in London, as the footage was edited, Isla struggled with the question of how to end her film. The easy choice would have been triumph, to celebrate the bravery, the sacrifice, the patriotism. But what she felt most strongly was not triumph, but tenderness. The divers had not died for glory. They had simply gone where they were told to go, doing their duty with quiet precision, their courage measured not by victory, but by the calm acceptance of disappearance. She titled the film, The Deep Still Breathes. It premiered in a small art house cinema, then spread by word of mouth, gathering a following far larger than she had ever expected. Audiences sat in silence during the closing scene. A long, unbroken shot of the fjord at dusk, the water shimmering gold, the camera slowly panning down until the reflection of the sky vanished into darkness. The final line, taken from her ancestor's manuscript, appeared on screen. They are still working, somewhere beneath this silence. The film resonated across generations, stirring something that the world's constant noise had nearly drowned, the need to remember the invisible, to honor the anonymous courage that underpins every visible freedom. Veterans wrote to her, strangers sent letters from as far as New Zealand and Japan, and one elderly man who had served in the Royal Navy sent a small parcel containing a medal and a note that simply read, "For those who did not return, but never stopped serving." Isla placed the medal in a display case, not behind glass, but inside a hollow of driftwood she kept near her desk, something living, imperfect, touched by the sea. Months later, she returned once more to the fjord. Alone this time, she stood at the same spot where her great-grandfather's granddaughter had left the plaque decades before. It was still there, worn by storms but legible. For those who went down and never rose, the sea remembers. Isla set her father's ashes into the water and watched as the urn drifted outward, slowly sinking until the ripples stilled. The wind moved across the surface, carrying with it the faintest echo of sound, not quite voice, not quite memory, but something between them, a vibration of presence. In that moment, she felt the full weight of what generations had tried to say, that remembrance is not a monument, but a tide, and that some stories never end because they are carried forward in the bloodstream of those who refuse to let them fade. The camera recorded her standing there, still as a statue, as the sky dimmed to violet, and the first stars appeared above the water. Later, when she reviewed the footage, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A faint green pulse beneath the surface, timed almost like a heartbeat. The sonar team confirmed no mechanical interference. It was, by all accounts, nothing. Yet she smiled when she saw it, because she knew what it meant. The sea, in its quiet way, had answered again. In the decades that followed, The Deep Still Breathes became more than a film. It became a ritual. Schools screened it every year on Remembrance Day. Universities used it in courses on memory and war. Museums projected its final scene across walls of glass and stone. Yet what lingered most powerfully was not the image of the divers themselves, but the silence that followed the credits, the sense of space left behind for the audience to inhabit, to imagine the unseen, to fill with their own sense of loss. The story of the 3 British divers who had sabotaged a Nazi ship and vanished into the Black Fjord evolved into something beyond history. It became a symbol of what could not be archived: devotion without recognition, sacrifice without witness, love offered to the vast, indifferent sea. For a new generation, born into the digital century, the divers were not just relics of a distant war, but reminders that meaning is often found in what disappears. Artists painted them as ghostly silhouettes swimming upward through light. Poets wrote verses about their descent as metaphor for faith in unseen causes. Composers transformed sonar pings into symphonies that mimicked the rhythm of their slow, deliberate movements beneath the waves. The sea became an instrument of memory, a place where sound and silence coexisted, where loss did not vanish, but echoed. Even scientists studying the fjord spoke differently now. When discussing its geology, they sometimes used words like sacred or hallowed, acknowledging that data alone could not measure the human weight carried in those depths. The Royal Navy, perhaps moved by public sentiment, or perhaps out of a quiet guilt that bureaucracy had long suppressed, finally declassified the documents related to the operation. Inside those faded files were coordinates, training logs, and brief psychological evaluations of the three men. Their names were released to the public at last: Lieutenant Commander Henry Ward, Petty Officer Thomas Reeve, and able seaman Michael Ashcroft. The files revealed small human details: the handwriting of a man who always wrote in block letters, the request for a second letter to be sent to his wife if he did not return, the note scribbled in pencil on the edge of a map. If we fail, make sure they remember why. Those pages, now yellow and fragile, were displayed in the Imperial War Museum beneath dim light, where visitors leaned close to read the words as if they were relics of scripture. For Eisler, who had uncovered their story and given it voice, the revelation brought a strange mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. Names were necessary, yes, they restored humanity, but they also confined mystery. What had once been boundless and mythic now had edges, biographies, photographs. She realized that the story had belonged not only to these three men, but to everyone who had carried them in silence for generations. Memory, she thought, was not ownership, but participation. And so she continued her work, not as a director, but as a custodian of remembrance, traveling to schools, speaking to children who had never known a world without peace, telling them that courage is not the absence of fear, but the quiet persistence of purpose. In the fjord, the water remained unchanged. Beneath the shimmering surface, the wrecks had become habitats for fish and coral, life blooming among the ruins of destruction. Nature had reclaimed what war had left behind, softening metal with time, turning the diver's resting place into something tender and alive. Marine biologists who explored the site often described an inexplicable serenity there, currents that moved gently, visibility clearer than expected, a sense of stillness that defied the violent history of the place. Some said it felt as though the sea itself was guarding them, honoring the vow it had once made, to remember. One summer evening, on the 80th anniversary of the sabotage, hundreds gathered by the fjord to commemorate the event. There were no speeches, no military bands, no flags. Just silence. Each person held a small candle, and as the sun dipped behind the cliffs, they placed them on the water. One by one, the flames drifted outward, reflections trembling like stars across the black surface. For a few minutes, it seemed the night itself had become alive with light. Then a wind rose, and the flames began to vanish, swallowed by the same element that had taken the divers so long ago. Yet no one moved to stop it. They watched in reverence, understanding that disappearance was part of the ritual, that memory, to remain sacred, must sometimes return to silence. In that moment, standing among strangers united by a story older than themselves, Eisler understood what her family's generations had sought. The sea had not stolen those men, it had given them eternity. The act of remembrance was no longer about grief or even honor. It was about continuity, the passing of light through time, the endless movement between forgetting and recalling. And somewhere beneath that calm, eternal surface, the divers still rested, not as lost souls, but as the sea's quiet conscience, still working, still breathing in the memory of all who dared to remember them. Morning over the fjord came softly, the light spreading like breath across glass. The cliffs, once dark and severe, glowed faintly gold, as if time itself were forgiving them. The tide moved with its patient rhythm, rising and falling over the stones that had listened to 80 years of wind and silence. No sound of engines, no echo of war, only the slow pulse of water touching rock, like memory rehearsing itself once more. And somewhere beneath that calm surface, where the light fades and the cold begins, the story of the three divers continued to rest. The sea had not forgotten. It never does. In the museum in London, a small boy stood before the display case that held the diver's compass. He pressed his face close to the glass, and whispered the words he had read on the plaque. If we fail, make sure they remember why. He did not understand the full weight of the sentence, but something in its quiet promise stayed with him. His teacher spoke softly about bravery, about silence, about the cold Black Sea. Years later, when that boy grew into a man, he would return to Norway with his own children, pointing to the water and saying only, "Listen," because sometimes remembrance is not a speech or a monument, but a pause, an act of attention that lets the world breathe again. For those who still lived along the coast, the story remained part of the landscape. Fishermen claimed the sea changed color on winter nights, deepening to a blue so dark it seemed lit from within. Some said they saw shadows moving beneath the boats, slow and deliberate, like figures walking the floor of the ocean. Scientists dismissed it as tricks of light and tide, but the locals knew better. They left small offerings at the shore, pieces of rope, candles in jars, scraps of fabric torn from old uniforms, as if speaking to unseen guardians below. The sea never answered with words, but it kept its stillness, and in that stillness there was understanding. Isla returned one last time, older now, her hair streaked with silver, her movements deliberate. The world had turned faster than she could follow, conflicts flaring, machines replacing hands, noise devouring silence. Yet when she reached the fjord, time slowed. The air smelled of salt and pine. She walked down to the edge, where the tide touched her boots, and felt the same shiver her ancestor must have felt decades before. She did not bring cameras or scripts, only a small notebook. She wrote a single line: "The deep still breathes, and we are all its witnesses." Then she closed the notebook and set it on the rocks, leaving it for the wind to decide its fate. As dusk fell, the northern lights appeared, first faintly, then in sweeping curtains of green and violet that rippled across the sky. They mirrored themselves in the water until it was impossible to tell where the heavens ended and the sea began. It was as if the world itself were remembering, the light descending to touch the places where words could not reach. In that shimmering silence, it was easy to believe that somewhere below, the three divers were still there. Not ghosts, but guardians of a story that refused to end. The sea had become their cathedral, its floor their resting ground, its vastness their eternity. The camera, if it had been there, would have lingered on that horizon, on the quiet union of sky and sea, on the faint motion of the water breathing. Then the screen would fade slowly to black, the sound of waves continuing for a few moments after the image disappeared. And before the silence reclaimed everything, one final line would rise across the dark. For those who went down and never rose, the sea remembers. If you too remember, leave a trace, a light, a word. Like the tide, remembrance must always return. If this story moved you, if the silence between its words spoke to something in you, like, share, and subscribe to keep their memory alive. Because some stories are not meant to end. They are meant to echo,